Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 in a series of videos for Mod X, an abstract strategy game from Cryptozoic Entertainment. Now this is a game for 2 to 4 players. In this video I'm going to show you how to play the game. If you want to bypass this tutorial and just see some sample gameplay, you can check out my sample gameplay video. You can check out my full review video, or if you just want a quick overview of how the game plays, check out my quick overview video. When this is the video, this is going to be a complete tutorial to teach you how to play the game. Now Mod X is a game again for 2 to 4 players, and you're going to be playing for a certain amount of victory points. That's based on the amount of players. And you can also play the game as a team-based game. If you're playing as a 2-player game, players are vying to get 15 victory points. If you're trying to play this as a 3-player game, you're each trying to get to 12 victory points. And as a 4-player game, each player is trying to get to 10 victory points. Now, if you do decide to play it as a team-based game, that means each team has to get 12 combined victory points. So if we had red and black versus orange and yellow, each team has to get a combined of 12 victory points to beat the other team. And as soon as one player or one team manages to get their victory point total, the game's instantly going to come to an end. There's not going to be any extra rounds or extra turns for the other team. As soon as somebody gets the victory points, it's game over and a winner is announced. Now in Mod X, the players are trying to place their X's on the board to create patterns that are going to earn them victory points. And these victory points are going to be marked with these squares to let them know that they managed to gain victory points by gaining control of the squares on the board. Of course, these are tenuous squares because other players can steal these squares from you, and again, you're racing at the victory point total. Or if one player manages to place all their X's or places all their squares on the board, then the game's also going to come to an end with the victor decided as the player who has the most squares, or again the team with the most squares. Now in the game, players will be placing one X at a time on the turn, then play is going to pass to the next player. And you can score by making one of 4 different patterns, and it's all going to be involving 5 X's. You can get a 5 in a row as a up and down or as an orthogonal. You get 5 in a row as a diagonal. You can get a 5 by creating an X, or you can get 5 by creating a plus sign. Now there's also some ghost or joker or wild card pieces, whatever you want to refer to them as. I'm going to refer to them as wild cards. The rules do refer to them as jokers, but I like to call them wild card pieces because any player can use these wild card pieces to create patterns. You can use these to create the patterns, but these individual wild card pieces do not score points. Now if you happen to use them to create a pattern though, the pieces that are your color will score victory points, but the wild card pieces themselves will not actually score victory points. And they're actually going to be moved after they've been used to score for the player who happens to use them. Well, we'll get to that when we get to that point right on. But let's go ahead and tell you how to set up the game and then how to play the game of Mod X. At the start of the game, the oldest player is going to start the game. They're going to start the game by placing the 5 wild card pieces out on the board. Now the game does come with 8 wildcard pieces, and they do include those in case you want to do any other variants, and it does change up the difficulty of the game quite a bit, and also the speed of the game by including up to 8 of these wildcard pieces if you do decide to do so. But in the basic rules, you're only going to include 5 of these, and the oldest player starts the game by placing all 5 of these on the board. Now the only rule that you have to follow when placing all 5 of these wildcard pieces on the board is that they can't be touching each other, which means they can't be adjacent. So you can't be starting out the game by creating any patterns or giving yourself any kind of advantages. Of course, I say that because you're trying to create an advantage by placing these pieces out in a way that's going to give you an advantage when your turn finally comes back around. After the oldest player has placed all 5 of the wildcard pieces down, the next player in play order starts the game by placing one of their X's anywhere on the board. And then the game is going to keep going around as each player takes their turns placing exactly one X on the board, trying to create patterns of any kind. Again, there are the 5 different patterns that the players are trying to create. Whether it happens to be the plus sign, whether it happens to be the X pattern, or it happens to be the 5 in a row pattern, whether that's orthogonal or that happens to be diagonal. Those are the 5 patterns that the players are trying to create. If a player manages to place one of their X's on the board, that's going to complete one of the patterns. They're going to remove all the X's they used to complete that pattern, and they're going to replace all those X's with their squares. That's going to score them victory points. Of course, the caveat to that is if they use one of the wild card pieces to complete that pattern, they're not going to score any victory points for that specific wild card piece, and then they're going to take that wild card piece and place it somewhere else on the board. Now, there's 2 caveats to placing the wild card piece. One, you can't place it on the board in a way that's going to create another pattern instantly, and there's one exception to that, and that's the other caveat for the rules. If you manage to place the wild card piece down in a pattern with the other 4 wild card pieces on the board, or more if you're playing with one of the variants where you're adding more of the wild cards to the board, but if you manage to complete a complete pattern using the wild card pieces only, it doesn't matter how many victory points you have or your opponents have, you instantly win the game. So there's part of the strategy of this in a way to try to move your pieces around to get these wild card pieces up. Because again, if you can complete a complete pattern using these wild card pieces only, you can instantly win the game. So to show you an example, this placement right here will not be a valid placement because it's going to create a complete pattern for the black player right here, which will not be a legal placement. But I could place it over here, which is not going to complete another pattern. Of course, again, if I can create that 5-piece pattern using the wild cards only, I'm going to instantly win the game. Now, the other trick to realize about the game, though, is if you manage to complete a pattern on top of another player's square, now you can't complete patterns on top of other people's X's, but you can complete them on top of other players' squares. Now, if you can complete it on top of another player's square, you're actually going to take that square away from them, so players are constantly fighting for these squares, and you can have them taken away from you multiple times. Now, notice we don't actually pull the other player's square off the board because we are dealing with a finite timer of the fact that people will be eventually running out of pieces if nobody reaches the final score, and that is the other end game condition to end the game, and then you're going to add up the points and see who has the most squares to be the winner. But of course, you're simply going to cover those up and you can keep going on like that also. Also, do note that if a player manages to create a pattern and they don't realize they did that on their turn, then any other player can touch one of the X's as part of that pattern, remove all the pieces from this board that are in that color, and then add all the pieces onto the board in your color, scoring you the victory points for completing that pattern on the board. So in this effort, you can actually score victory points by using other people's other players' pieces. So you have to make sure you're paying careful attention, making sure you're watching when you're placing your pieces down and paying attention that when you are completing patterns. That way other players don't steal your victory points from you. Players can also complete multiple patterns at one time with all their pieces, and they would be able to score all those locations if they're able to do so. And this is going to allow players to score some very large victory points amounts if they manage to get multiple patterns in one play. And again, getting lots of squares on the board. This can actually be a game-ending win if you're not careful in watching what the other players are doing, because you can very easily score up to 10 points in one move. Again, if the other players aren't watching exactly what you're doing and paying attention and blocking you from scoring multiple patterns at the same time. The game is going to continue on like this until one player manages to score the amount of victory points for the win, depending on the amount of players, so 10, 12, or 15 victory points. Or you get to the point where one player is no longer allowed to place X's on the board because they no longer have any, or until one player places their last tile on the board. If the game ends because of one of those victory conditions, and the person who has the most squares on the board is going to become the victor. Now, even if you have a square with another X on top of it, that's still your square for victory points. The other player does not get to score that. But if another player has managed to cover up one of your victory points, then you don't get victory points for that square. So you're only going to get victory points for squares that are in your color, depending on, or not mattering whether another player has X's on top of it. Again, you're going to add up the scores. Whoever has the most squares total is going to be the winner of the game. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial video for Mod X. If you have any comments or questions, make sure you leave them in the YouTube comments down below. I'll be sure to answer them as quickly as I can. You can also feel free to email me at offtheshelfboardgamereviews. That's otsbgr@gmail.com. Try to answer your question as quickly as I can. If you enjoyed this video series, you want to see more like it, click that like button, click that subscribe button. As always, thanks for watching.